Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 95.
The next matter, number 25-1705, Dinner Table Action et al. Versus William J. Snyder et al., and number 25-1706, Dinner Table Action et al. Versus Equal Citizens et al.
If you're like most people, you look at our hyper-polarized political landscape and assume the endless rage is driven entirely by its social media algorithms or broken human nature. But what if the fuel driving our outrage engine isn't just culture? It's a specific legal loophole that pumps unlimited, unregulated money to flood voters with fear, outrage, and manipulation. Worse, what if the dominant narrative about how to fix it is completely wrong? And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckemeyer, and our guest today is Harvard Law professor, author, and democracy advocate Larry Lessig. Today, he breaks down a surprising legal strategy currently playing out in the federal courts that could dismantle super PACs without needing a constitutional amendment or a Supreme Court rewrite.
This case presents a single question. When the people of Maine decided, by the largest vote in the state's 206-year history, that unlimited super PAC contributions were corrupting their elections, did the First Amendment leave them powerless? It did not. Maine's law regulates contributions. The district court made a huge mistake applying expenditure law, not contributions law, and that mistake has profound implications.
That's Neil Katyal arguing the case in the U.S. First Court of Appeals. It's a fascinating look at how fixing the underlying structural mechanics might just be our best shot at reining in the outrage machine.
Otherwise, we're left where the district court left us. The government can ban a $10,000 direct contribution to a candidate, but it can't ban the $10 million one to the candidate-aligned super PAC. That's upside down. It's clearly wrong. And, Your Honors, if not now, when? And if not on this record, what record are we going to need to do something about this tremendous damage to our political process?
Stay tuned. Larry Lessig, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Thanks for having me.
So, I talk a lot about political polarization on this show and some of the reasons behind it. I've talked to a lot of scientists. And, a common way that this gets presented in media is basically just a cultural misunderstanding, or maybe it's all the fault of social media algorithms. But I think the work that you're doing shows there's these underlying sort of design flaws, and we could say they're sort of deliberate. With super PACs and these mega donors injecting so much money into these election cycles, the highest return on investment comes from triggering outrage and fear, and they want to try to drive voter turnout. And if you combine that with partisan gerrymandering, where a lot of that PAC money really goes straight to speaking to these most extreme voters because they're the ones who are showing up in those primaries where everything is mostly decided in those safe districts. So with all that, is it possible to de-escalate our outrage engine without cutting off the unlimited cash that rewards it?
Well, I think the answer is no, it's not. But I would also say I'm not sure even whether that's going to be enough. But we ought to start there, because that's fueling the outrage engine in a way that is almost unbeatable given the balance of forces that otherwise would exist. So we ought to find a way to end at least this part of the problem and see whether that's going to be enough.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because, right, everybody kind of wants the one silver bullet, and that's probably not realistic. We sort of need to do all the things.
Absolutely. But I think it's also important to recognize the order that we have to do these things in, right? So I'm all in favor of gerrymandering reform, and I'm all in favor of voting rights reform and all sorts of clever ideas like ranked choice voting, single party primaries. That's all really important. But in my view, none of those are effective unless you first deal with the money issue. And so that's why, again, dealing with the most extreme money issue, super PACs, is the most important problem to take up first.
Okay, yeah. So you've watched this trajectory of sort of the Silicon Valley world for a few generations here, and a generation ago, many of these tech founders kind of resisted politics, and they didn't want to hire lobbyists and thought they were above it all. And today we see lots of financial investment into extreme that results in some of the most extreme polarizing political organizations. And so let's sort of avoid the kind of lazy narrative that they just changed their ideologies, and maybe something else happened that the super PACs kind of helped drive them to say, I can't sit on the sidelines. I have to get involved in this. Would you say that's a fair way of looking at it?
I think that is fair. I think it's also fair to say that, the lobbyists are keen to convince these corporations that they have a reason to hire them.
Right.
And so what they do is they convince the corporations that the return on investment from hiring lobbyists can be much higher than the return on investment for inventing a new widget. So they'll have like tax policy changes that they plausibly think they can get through Congress. And they can show that the tax policy change will have a huge return on investment for the dollars spent in lobbying. They just bring it to the financial people in the company and they say, look, this makes sense, right? You're going to get a 600% return on investment here. Why wouldn't you invest your money in that? And so I think this is the dynamic that, conservatives call crony capitalism that slowly swallows these huge corporations into the mess of Washington because it just makes financial sense to invest in policy, given how cheaply policy can be bought.
Yeah, I think that's probably a whole other conversation we can have.
Yeah.
But I want to look at your federal case in Maine. If I get it right, there's an overwhelming 75% of voters chose to cap contributions to super PACs at $5,000. And the dominant narrative on this is that Citizens United makes it impossible to regulate, the money unless we do a constitutional amendment. It's very, feels very defeatist. So, but this case seems to challenge that head on, if I understand it right. And can you explain a little bit the legal distinction and sort of the blueprint you're relying on, and why regulating contributions to super PACs is completely legal, distinct from regulating their independent spending?
Yeah, you've stated it exactly correctly, which makes you in a very small group of people because the vast majority of people think that Citizens United gave us super PACs. Now, Citizens United was decided 16 years ago in January of 2010, and it triggered a real political resistance to that decision. And it triggered it for lots of reasons, complicated reasons, the most salient being that the court seemed to make it sound like it was creating First Amendment rights for corporations. It really wasn't doing that, but that's the way it sounded. And so it fueled a movement of people who were attacking that decision because it just seemed of a piece with the way so much in politics was working, that we were shifting our democratic power over to these elites, to these corporations, and there was a desire to build a movement to fight back. And so, my friend Bernie Sanders is the most, articulate and vociferous in his criticism of Citizens United, which he calls one of the worst decisions in the 20th century, 21st century too. And in attacking it, he makes it sound like the only way we can address the most perverse part of this money, super PACs, is by overturning Citizens United. Again and again, he will say, we have to overturn Citizens United. Well, when a lawyer hears that, what a lawyer hears is, okay, well, then there's nothing to be done because this Supreme Court is absolutely not going to overturn Citizens United. So if you're telling me the only way to solve this problem is to do something that's impossible, I'm going to move on to another kind of problem to solve, because why should I waste my time on a problem that is impossible to solve? But what Bernie's framing misses is that Citizens United said nothing about the rules that would create super PACs. What created super PACs was not the freedom to spend whatever money you had. It was the freedom to collect contributions of unlimited size. That rule was created not by Citizens United. It was created by a lower federal court applying the reasoning it thought of Citizens United to a completely different question. Citizens United asked, can you limit the spending of a corporation or a rich person or a political action committee if that spending is independent of the campaign? And the court said, no, you can't limit the spending. Speech Now, a lower federal court a case decided 3 months after Citizens United said, can you limit the size of the contributions to a committee that is going to spend its money independently? And the DC Circuit looked at that question and thought it was the same question as Citizens United. It said, look, if Citizens United says there's no risk of corruption with independent spending, then it has to follow as a matter of logic that there's no risk of corruption from a contribution to a committee that's going to then make independent spending. And that assumption is just flatly false. It's a logical mistake. And once you see it, I mean, I don't mean to sound like I a know-it-all here. I didn't get it. I didn't get it originally. It took some really great lawyer, Ron Fine for Free Speech for People, to hit me over the head with this argument 10 times before I saw it. So I understand how this is not obvious. But once you see this mistake, you can't unsee it. And I think the easiest way to see it is to look to my favorite United States Senator, Robert Menendez from New Jersey, who in 2015 was indicted for quid pro quo bribery. And the allegation was that in exchange for government favors, Robert Menendez asked a rich guy to give a bunch of money to his super PAC. Okay, so there is a quid pro quo, what the court thinks of as the quintessential corruption. Quid pro quo, this for that. Government favor in exchange for some private benefit. A quid pro quo, but the quid pro quo involves a contribution to a super PAC. The thing that DC Circuit said could not happen is what he was indicted for. And indeed, his lawyers had the chutzpah to say, hey, the thing you've indicted us for, the DC Circuit said, as a matter of logic, cannot happen. So therefore, you ought to dismiss this indictment. And of course, the court didn't dismiss the indictment, kind of chuckled, but it pointed to the logical mistake in the lower court decision that gave us super PACs. And that decision has never been appealed to the Supreme Court. And no other court has had the chance to have that question taken up by the Supreme Court to address that core flaw. And so what people have been doing since about 2016 is trying to find a way to get this question before the court so that the court has the opportunity to decide whether Citizens United entails super PACs, whether Citizens United means we must have super PACs. And what we think is when the court gets a chance to answer that question, what the court's going to say is, hey, Bernie, there's nothing wrong with Citizens United. We like Citizens United. Citizens United is our principle of how the First Amendment regulates campaign speech. But nothing in Citizens United should limit the ability of a state or Congress to limit the size of a contribution to an independent political action committee, because obviously such contributions can create the risk of quid pro quo corruption. Indeed, in our case, in the district court, for the first time, a federal court has said this. The district court said, yeah, of course, contributions to independent political action committees create the risk of corruption. But nonetheless, the court said, still, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, that is the most extreme decision of a federal court ever in the history of federal courts talking about this question. And so what we think is when the court, first of all, the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which is going to first decide this case, gets a chance to consider it, the court's going to say, yeah, no, this does not follow from Citizens United. It might follow from the DC Circuit, but we're not bound by the DC Circuit. We're the First Circuit. So the First Circuit will say, we've evaluated Citizens United. Citizens United does not block the state of Maine from passing an initiative that bans super PACs, which it did with 75% of the vote in November 2024. And so when the First Circuit concludes that, then the Supreme Court will have to take the question up. And I think the Supreme Court will be very happy to say, Bernie Sanders, you're wrong, but super PACs can be limited. And the whole country will then say, huzzah, because what we can see, in Maine, where 75% of the voters oppose this, what we can see is that this is not a Republican-Democrat issue. This is an issue all of us see. All of us look at this system and say that the system is deeply corrupt. And so therefore, we should have the freedom to do something about that corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. That breaks it down. I will say that I had never heard of that speech now case until I was reading some of the stuff you're talking about, and so I had never heard of it. So I bet I'm not alone in that. Like that case isn't out there in the news. I don't think. And of course,
Absolutely right. Yeah.
I'm not a legal wonk, so it makes sense. But I mean, it seems like it's something we should know more about. And I know you just described it to some degree. Can you tell us, maybe just even dumb it down for me even more, about how the Maine case really exposes this problem with that case?
Yeah. So I think it's again, as I said, I didn't get it, so it's hard to get. But maybe this is the best way to see it. The first thing you've got to do is something which it's really hard for people to do, and that is to see why Citizens United was right. Okay, so here's why Citizens United was right. If you assume, which Citizens United did, based on a case 50 years ago, a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, if you assume that the only basis for limiting political speech is the risk of quid pro quo corruption, then Citizens United is right. Because what Citizens United said is, we're talking about independent speech. And independent speech means, regulated means, speech where there is no coordination between the campaign and the speaker. So the court has said in Buckley, they said this 50 years ago, if there's no coordination, then there's no risk of quid pro quo, because quid pro quo requires a coordination, or put it the other way around. If there's quid pro quo, if you said, I'll do this if you do that, then obviously there's coordination. So the fact that there is no coordination means that the speech is independent. And if the speech is independent, then you can't regulate it because there's no risk of corruption. Now, many people hear that and they say, oh, come on. Elon Musk spends $270 million to support Donald Trump. You're going to tell me that there was no coordination between Elon Musk and Donald Trump? And the answer is no, I'm not going to tell you that. But what I am going to tell you is that what the Supreme Court said in Buckley 50 years ago is, if there is coordination, then the speech is not independent. Instead, it's a contribution to the campaign. And if it's a contribution to the campaign, $270 million is a lot more than the maximum contribution you're allowed to make to a campaign. It's a felony to contribute $270 million to a campaign. So the point is, there is a regulation in place that says this speech is independent if it's uncoordinated. And if it's coordinated, it's not independent speech, it's a contribution. Okay, so that's the Citizens United have. And that's why I'm saying if you accept the first move, which says that the only basis for limiting is a risk of corruption, then Citizens United was correct. Okay, but then ask the question in the context of Speech Now. Speech Now addressed the question whether a contribution to a campaign, which will then, contribution to a committee that will then spend the money independently of the campaign, is also incapable of being limited because also creates no risk of quid pro quo corruption. Okay, but here's the difference. Remember I said with the spending, there's a regulation that requires that it be uncoordinated. There's no regulation requiring that the contribution be uncoordinated. There's nothing that stops a donor from sitting with the candidate and saying, hey, I'm going to give $270 million to your super PAC because I like you and what you're doing. No regulation like that at all. And so the requirements for spending don't exist with the contribution. And so what that means is even if logically, given the regulation, there's no risk of corruption with the expenditure, the same rules don't apply with the contribution. There is a risk of corruption with the contribution. And indeed, in our case, we have a whole bunch of briefs written by friends that we call Friends of the Court, amicus briefs, which go through case after case of contributions that are clearly contributions as quid pro quos to a candidate in exchange for favors from that candidate. So the Robert Menendez case is one example, but there are many, many other examples. And I would say, look at the current administration if you need to see these examples, right? Donald Trump in April of 2024 stood in front of oil executives and said, if you raise $1 billion for my campaign, I will relax oil regulations on day one. Okay, what is that? That's a quid pro quo. In exchange for your money, I will do something in government, relax regulations. The only way to give Donald Trump $1 billion is to give it to his super PAC. So there it is, a quid pro quo involving a contribution to a super PAC. And so the point is, once you see that it's everywhere, and you realize what the court has said is if there's a risk of corruption, you can regulate it. What follows from that is the state of Maine, the people of Maine, should have the right to limit the size of contributions that are going into these campaigns so that candidates are not tempted to engage in this kind of corruption.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Another aspect of this that I was seeing is that you're, instead of sort of trying to come up with, sort of progressive ideals about fairness, that you're basically taking a dominant philosophy that the Supreme Court holds of originalism and sort of turning it back on them, if I understand it right. And you've argued that from a historical standpoint, the framers never intended for a small fraction of the country to sort of drown out everybody else or drown out the civic square. So how does looking back at some of that founding history give us, a concrete legal weapon to fight these super PACs? Right.
So the argument I just been laying out to you is the kind of right down the middle core campaign finance argument. It builds on a case decided almost exactly 50 years ago, Buckley versus Vallejo, which was the first Supreme Court case striking down election integrity legislation on the basis of the First Amendment. And it's since Buckley, the court has crafted this increasingly elaborate doctrine to try to police what the people or Congress can do to police corruption in campaigns. There's a fundamental question, though, about where does the court get off crafting this whole doctrine really out of whole cloth ever since Buckley 50 years ago. And indeed, on the Supreme Court, there's a very prominent theory, which now 6 justices of the Supreme Court say that they follow. And that theory is the theory of originalism. And what originalism says is we should go back to the original moment when a constitutional provision was adopted and ask what that provision meant then. When it was adopted, what did it mean? And that meaning is the meaning we should apply in determining questions today. So, for example, Justice Thomas, one of the most prominent originalists on the Supreme Court, has said that the doctrine announced by the Supreme Court in the 1960s of New York Times versus Sullivan, which basically protects reporters from defamation lawsuits when they happen to report something that turns out not to be true, so long as they were not intentionally saying something false, they're immune under New York Times versus Sullivan. So Thomas doesn't believe in that doctrine. And so he has, in a number of cases, said the Supreme Court needs to overturn it. And the way he's made that argument is he has said, look, New York Times versus Sullivan is policymaking dressed up in constitutional law. How does he know that? Well, he reads the opinion, and the opinion doesn't try to tell you why the original meaning of the First Amendment, the words the First Amendment enacted into law, actually produced the conclusion that says you have this special immunity if you're a reporter. He says the original meaning of the First Amendment would never have blocked somebody from suing for defamation if, in fact, what you published turned out not to be true. Now, I don't like the idea of overturning New York Times versus Sullivan because, as a political matter, I like New York Times versus Sullivan. But the point is, if you are going to be an originalist and apply your theory consistently, how does that same theory apply in the context of campaign finance jurisprudence? So when I read Justice Thomas talking about New York Times versus Sullivan, saying that it was policymaking dressed up as constitutional law, my first reaction, I think I literally screamed this or yelled this as I was reading the opinion. I was like, have you read Buckley versus Vallejo, which is this 144-page opinion, not signed by any justice? It's called a per curiam, which sets out this whole regime for how the First Amendment regulates regulation of campaign integrity, never once explaining how its regime derives from the original meaning of the First Amendment. Originalism is nowhere in that opinion. So I would say to Justice Thomas, okay, if this is your method, apply your method in the context of campaign finance jurisprudence and ask yourself the question whether the original meaning of the First Amendment would have given the court the power to second guess Congress's regulations of money in campaigns. And I think the absolutely certain answer to that question is no. And indeed, you don't have to take my word for it. Maybe my second favorite senator in this fight is Senator Josh Hawley. So Josh Hawley is no liberal, right? He's a very conservative senator from Missouri, former law professor. Josh Hawley, in October of 2023, introduced a bill in Congress that purported to overturn Citizens United. And how did he purport to overturn Citizens United? Well, when he introduced the bill, what he said was, as every good originalist knows, the original meaning of the First Amendment would never have restricted Congress's ability to regulate how corporations spend their money. Absolutely true. No doubt about that. And so the point is, under the original meaning of the First Amendment, if in fact they're going to be consistent in their application of originalism, it's also true that the people of Maine ought to have the freedom to limit the size of contributions to these independent political action committees. Indeed, it's easier than under the story I was telling you about quid pro quo corruption. Forget it. Forget all of that. This argument basically says Buckley versus Vallejo has no basis in constitutional law. So it's a more extreme position, but what we're actually doing is we're advancing both positions. So we're saying under the core mainstream argument, we win. But if you want to look at the originalist argument, it's even clearer that we win. So the originalist justices, who I think are very keen to demonstrate they're principled in their application of originalism, like Amy Coney Barrett or Justice Gorsuch, you would say to them, look, your originalism should lead you to the same conclusion. So at least agree with the core argument that we should be allowed to limit super PACs, even if you don't want to take the pretty dramatic step of overturning Buckley by saying that none of this limitations by the court is constitutionally permitted.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little bit of a distraction, maybe a little cynical, but I mean, how confident are you that this court will, be consistent?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a really important question. People call me the last naive law professor, and I admit that when I was younger, I'm obviously not young now, but when I was younger, I had this naive view that it's all that mattered really was the law. Just tell me what the answer is under the law. And that's what I thought the court would do. And that is just not the way the court functions. It's both the law and the politics. And I don't mean partisan politics, but I mean the political institutional reality of what that decision is. And so what I've argued so far is under the law, we win. We win under application of Citizens United. We win under an application of originalism. Either way, we win under the law. But then the fair question for realist people and people who are not lawyers is, okay, but under the politics, come on. Why do you believe that this Supreme Court is ever going to limit the ability of money in politics? And I say there's two reasons why I think they'll do it. Political reasons why I think they'll do it. The first thing is to realize super PACs are not something that benefits Republicans alone. So if you think the court decides cases on partisan basis, I don't, but if you think that they do, this is not a partisan issue for the court. This is not like if you uphold super PACs, Republicans win and Democrats lose. No, Democrats raise tons of money and in many elections raise more money. And so this is just as much a burden for Democrats as it is a burden for Republicans. So a partisan reason really doesn't tilt one way versus the other. The second type of politics, though, is institutional. Like, how does it help the court? So my point about the law is that for the court to go against us, the court would have to change its own doctrine and announce an even more extreme libertarian, meaning there's nothing you can do to regulate, campaign finance rule. Why would it do that? What's the reason to do that? What's the reason to change its own position, given we're living in this moment where every American realizes how deeply corrupt our government has become. Like this is like the gift that Donald Trump gives that just he can't stop giving, right? People can't look at the government right now and think this is a government without corruption. This is a government that's deeply corrupted right now. And it's partly corrupted because of this mistaken lower court view. So I feel like we're giving the court a gift. We're saying to the court, you don't have to go back on anything you've ever said. You can completely save face here. You can completely say, we've always been right about Buckley, about Citizens United. We've always been right that if there's no risk of corruption, you can't regulate. But the other half of what we've said is, if there is a risk of corruption, you can regulate. So if they said you can regulate, you can get rid of super PACs, institutionally, the court would win overwhelmingly because the whole public would say, oh my gosh, that's astonishing. It's astonishing. The Supreme Court has said this. What a great principled decision of the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court would say, yeah, it's principled. It's consistent with our principles. And okay, it's kind of an embarrassment that it's taken, well, if they decided it today, it would be 16 years. That by the time they decided, it'll probably be 18 years. It's kind of an embarrassment. It's taken the law 18 years to get this right, given the enormous consequence of this huge amount of money that's been in the political system for these last 18 years that otherwise in the Maine wouldn't have been there. But okay, not our fault. Nobody brought it before us in a way that gave us a chance to decide it. So finally somebody has. The state of Maine has done that. And we will decide the case now that the state of Maine has presented it. And we think the state of Maine is correct, that in fact you can regulate to eliminate this kind of risk of corruption.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So I like that you mentioned that this may be a gift that keeps on giving from Trump, because I think there's others too. That I think he has one side effect of maybe the upside of some of this is I think he is exposing a lot of these flaws and maybe creates opportunities that will improve our entire political environment.
I completely think that's right. And we should remember that in 2015, when Donald Trump came down the escalator and started going on stage debating those Republicans over and over and over again, what Donald Trump said was that super PACs are a corruption. They corrupt the political system. He was overwhelmingly opposed to super PACs. And I can tell you, I gathered signatures for this initiative in Maine on Election Day 2023. I was at a little town called Hollis, Maine. And the first guy to come up to me said, I'm here to get signatures to get Donald Trump on the ballot. What are you doing? And I showed him my initiative. And he read the initiative and he said, hell yeah. And he signed it. And he said, I'm going to get every Trump supporter to come over and sign this initiative. And that's what he did for the couple hours he was there that morning. Everybody who signed his petition came over and signed mine. Why? Because it's not a partisan issue. People get it. People are so tired of this money, especially in Maine, because it's a purple state, every election cycle, you have millions of dollars dumped on that state from out-of-staters who don't care about Maine. They care only about making sure that their particular interest gets advanced in the election in Maine. And so the point is, I think there's no reason why Donald Trump shouldn't say, look, I have from the beginning been opposed to super PACs. Now, I got to live with the system, the cards that I'm dealt with. Like the system has super PACs, so I'm going to stand up my super PACs to get my people elected, just like Democrats set up their super PACs to get their people elected. But from Donald Trump's perspective, I would think it would be a perfect thing for him to say, I have told you from the very beginning, this is a corrupt system. And so because it's corrupt, the court ought to permit the people of Maine or Utah or California or Georgia to eliminate that corruption by eliminating super PACs. And that would be an incredible victory if, in fact, that happened.
Yeah, it sure would. So when people, talk about political division, the popular advice is almost always focused on sort of interpersonal relationships, and we'll bridge the divide, we'll dialogue, we'll have listening circles. But I think we can't ignore the money in politics part of it, and how this is a deeper flaw. And I'm going to ask you about historical precedents on this. When in the past we've managed to do something, we managed to rein in some kind of corruption in the past. Did it come from sort of the hearts and minds first, or did it require sort of structural mechanics first?
Well, you're right that we've had many moments in our history where the kind of disgust with the corruption of the system forced political change. But that corruption is nothing compared to what it's become in America today. And so when you brought up the point, I think it's a good point and true, that the political spending helps polarize people. And why is that? Well, because the most effective political speech, the kind of ads you're going to buy if you're a super PAC, are these negative ads. They're the ones that rile people up or turn people off. And, your objective is to dampen down the number of votes on the other side and to rile up your side to get them out to vote. It turns out negative ads are the most effective technique to do that. And so that means if your business model is win elections and you've got endless money, you're going to flood the zone with these negative ads. But there's a similar thing going on, not by the politicians, but just by the media platforms, like, the algorithms that are driving what stuff you see on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, because those companies have a business interest. And what's their business interest? It's to maximize the amount of time that you sit there scrolling, because the more time you sit there scrolling, the more they can rent you out to the people who pay for ads on those platforms. And so these companies are not in the business of like electing Republicans or electing Democrats. They don't care about the politics. Maybe Elon Musk is different and X is different, but the other platforms don't care about the politics. They just care about making money. And they make money the more they keep you on the platform. Well, it just turns out the best way to keep you and me on the platform is to turn us into ignorant people who hate each other. Because the more we're angry, the more we're furious at the ignorant traitors on the other side, the more we doom scroll as we see just how terrible the other side is, the more time we spend on this platform. So the point is, it's a business model to just lock us into the platform that has this, I don't think it's intended, this unintended consequence of really destroying our capacity as a people to even understand the same issues, right? I did something before the last election I've never done before, which was I went back to my high school for a high school reunion. I grew up in the Kentucky part of Pennsylvania, Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is an extremely conservative part of Pennsylvania. And I knew that everybody I went to high school with, like I, was a Republican. I'm not a Republican, but I know most of them stayed as Republicans. And I was really puzzled. I just didn't understand how they could support Donald Trump. So what I decided to do was to go back and ask them, I want to understand, because I know the values you grew up with, they're my values. So how do we both, who grew up with the same values, have such a fundamental view about this man? And over the course of a year, really, we've continued this conversation. And the thing that's most striking to me is that whenever there's something really bizarre in our difference, it comes down to a difference in what we think is true. So the most dramatic example for me was I said to him, let's talk about the pardons of the January 6th defendants, people who were convicted of violence because of the storming of the Capitol. And I said, Ben, what do you think about that? And he said, well, at least he didn't pardon anybody who committed acts of violence. It was all the people who were nonviolent defendants. And I said, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? He pardoned everybody, every single person, including people who tried to kill police officers. He pardoned everybody. And Ben was startled, stunned. He had no idea, not because he's ignorant, not because he's doesn't, consume the news. It's just that the news feed that he is getting doesn't let him see this side, doesn't let him see this fact, because it doesn't help commit him to reading the news. If he saw this fact, he'd be like, oh, this is terrible. I don't want to watch this anymore. I'm going to go do some more farming rather than scroll on Facebook. And so the point is, if we begin to see that the platform is against us, against our democracy, not because it hates America, not because it wants to destroy democracy, but it just turns out that's the way you make the most money, then you begin to understand we've got to find a way to neutralize this. We got to find a way to pay attention to something else. We're not going to blow up Facebook or blow up Instagram as much as many of us, especially with kids, wish we could. It's not going to happen. But we got to understand that that's not the other side. What we're seeing in that platform, in that feed, is not the other side. And we have to find more context where we can sit down with the other side and rediscover. These are people with your values. They just view the world differently, and they have different theories about what makes things work. But they all want their kids to do well. They all want their kids to do better than they did. They all want them to have a chance to pursue a career that's meaningful to them. We all want them to have health care. All of these things are common. They're not differences between Republicans and Democrats. And if we don't find a practice that reminds us of that, then I really think this democracy is lost. I don't think we can survive another 2 or 3 cycles of telling ourselves the other side is the enemy, because the other side is not the enemy. They're your neighbors. And if we don't learn to live with your neighbor, then we've lost the idea of democracy.
Yeah, for sure. And, and on that point a little bit too, this is, people are sort of tired of we talk about building emotional resilience here, but people get sort of overwhelmed with these sort of cautionary tales that just failing systems, and it causes, this basically causes burnout and in the audience, but also in advocates as well. So you've been in the trenches of this for quite a while. So what is it? Was it some historical blueprint or some ongoing project, or what is it that gives you the aspect that gives you like the most concrete sense that we can do something about this?
Well, I mean, I think you're exactly right that, people are so exhausted by this mess. I mean, it's been the most important election, every election since 2000, right? I mean, that was the first most important election in your lifetime. And then every election since then has been the most important election in your lifetime. And people who are, my age, like we remember a different time. Like we remember a saner time, not a time where necessarily we agreed with what the government did, but at least a time where there was a kind of coherence. Like we all understood what we were arguing about, even though we had very sharp disagreements between us, we still understood what we were arguing about. And the 1990s, which only old people like me at least remember the 90s as if they were yesterday. But the 90s, is a weird time when, the leading television or shows like Friends or Seinfeld, which are completely about nothing. It's just happy people living their life, and it's the humor and so, it's that period which ends in 2000. And since 2000, we've had this exhausting, constant story about how things are falling apart and we're falling behind. And most Americans look at their position, where they are, and they think this is just getting worse and worse. And what can we do about it? And so I think the first thing you need is, Harvey Milk, who was a leading gay activist in California, in San Francisco, before it was cool to be a leading gay activist, used to say, you got to give him hope. You got to give him hope. You got to give him a reason to think there's something that can happen. And that's why I think this case is really so important. I'm increasingly so turned off by the idea of trying to litigate our ways to justice. I think the biggest mistake liberals made was to think that their fight should be a fight for 5 justices in the Supreme Court. Because what they should have been fighting for is a majority of Americans to support their ideas, not 5 justices in the Supreme Court. So I typically think the Supreme Court is the last place we ought to be fighting. But with this issue, it is the law that's blocking us from being able to do anything about the corruption that increasingly we see is everywhere. So we got to win in this case. And if we do win in this case, I think there'll be this moment where people are like, wow, it's not going to be the billionaires' elections anymore. Now, that's not to say that there won't be money and we don't have to solve the problem of money, but then people can begin to be creative once again about how can we fund campaigns so that they're not being sold to the highest bidder. So, before super PACs started, there was all sorts of innovation around the country about different ways to fund political campaigns. My favorite is the city of Seattle, which has created a voucher system which gives all voters vouchers for $25 vouchers, which then the candidates have to try to persuade them to give to the candidates, and then the candidates fund their campaigns with those vouchers. But the point is, if you're a candidate and you know that you're trying to raise money from people with vouchers, you're going to have block parties where you're talking to thousands of people, not cocktail parties where you're talking to 20 people to fund your campaign. So the point is, these are ways to make the political system more responsive to the voter, which is what we ought to have, right? James Madison in the Federalist Papers promised us a house that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. And then in Federalist 57, he clarified to say, by the people, he meant, quote, not the rich more than the poor. Okay, I like that I like that idea of democracy. That's what democracy should be. It should be dependent on all of us and not the rich more than the poor. But we've built a system where the politicians are dependent on the rich more than the poor. They don't get the support of the rich. Doesn't matter what the poor care about. They're not candidates. They can't qualify as candidates. They can't run competitive campaigns. So we have to change that reality. The first step, the liberating step, would be to end super PACs. Once you do that, I guarantee you're going to unleash an enormous amount of energy to do more. You know, we did a poll way back in the beginning of my work on this, where we found 96% of Americans, 96%, thought it was important to reduce the influence of money in politics, but 91% didn't think it was possible. So that's the politics of resignation. Like, we all wish we could fly like Superman, but it's a good thing most of us don't leap up of tall buildings because we can't fly like Superman. So as much as we wish, we don't do it because we think it's impossible. But if you discovered it was possible, if there were a way to fly like Superman, we'd all be leaping. And I think if Americans realize there is a way to reduce the influence of money in politics, there'd be an incredible amount of unleashed energy to try to find a way to do it by Republicans and Democrats alike. I don't think, again, this is not a partisan issue. The Brennan Center just released a study 2 weeks ago where the overwhelming cross-partisan view of Americans is that this is a broken system. And this is the one thing we all agree on. And we ought to find an ability to leverage that agreement to actually begin to make real change happen.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, Larry Lessig, and thank you so much for making time for our show.
Thanks for having me.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Outrage Overload is a Connors Institute podcast. The Connors Institute for Nonpartisan Research and Civic Engagement at Shippensburg University works to disseminate high-quality, nonpartisan information to the American public around issues of societal well-being, democracy promotion, and news literacy. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.